Hey guys, welcome to another Lessons with Dr. T. This is our second part of the Cold War, and if you watched the first part, we talked about the idea of Russia, USSR, United States now becoming enemies against each other, and then of course the split of Germany and how it was divided, and you have West Germany and East Germany being a communist bloc, and then within Germany itself, or East Germany itself, you have Berlin, which is also split into two portions, East Berlin and West Berlin. And then you have this Berlin airlift that came about, and then at that point the Germans said, we're not going to have this anymore, we're going to build this wall. And in essence, they built the wall pretty much right around the entire east and west portion, right? So the wall pretty much encompassed all of West Berlin, because no one could get from East Berlin or East Germany into West Berlin so that they could get out. All right, that was the whole idea. They basically surrounded East or West Berlin as a whole. All right, so this right here is that Berlin Wall. It was built in 1961, and it was basically very much the Iron Curtain, even though it wasn't iron, it was just more the ideology of an Iron Curtain, but it was basically to maintain control of East Berlin and the rest of Eastern Germany. All right, and so the idea here is that Russia is a big part of the issue that comes about. So we're going to watch 3 videos, and that'll be it for our lesson today. So here we go, the Berlin Wall.
While Khrushchev's scheme took root in the Caribbean, the two Cold War superpowers faced off over the increasingly contentious issue of Berlin. By the 1960s, West Berlin was a thriving cosmopolitan city. In the words of one Cold War historian, the West German capital was a permanent advertisement for the virtues of capitalism and democracy in the middle of communist East Germany. Still, West Berliners lived with the fear that the communists could cut off land access to their city, as they had done during the Berlin blockade in 1948. Jobs, prosperity, and freedom, and the security afforded by the American military presence beckoned to the hungry, disenfranchised, and repressed of East Germany. To the exasperation of their communist leaders, millions fled across the open border. By the time President Kennedy met Nikita Khrushchev in 1961, millions of East Germany's best and brightest had left the country, and the mass exodus had become a crisis for the communists.
Marxism was born in Germany. If it does not prove itself as superior and vital here, then we have not won.
Tired of haggling over the divided city, Khrushchev issued an ultimatum to the American president: withdraw U.S. troops currently occupying West Berlin, or face a blockade. Kennedy stood his ground.
We will at all times be ready to talk, if talk will help. But we must also be ready to resist with force, if force is used upon us. The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin.
War did not come to Berlin, but a wall did. Barbed wire and concrete 12 feet high and 100 miles long, isolating West Berlin. East German border patrols had orders to shoot to kill, and they did. The wall was a hateful thing, Khrushchev admitted, but what should I have done? The East German economy would have collapsed. The much-hated Berlin Wall finally settled the nagging German question and averted war in Europe. But events elsewhere threatened to push the world to the brink of destruction.
All right, so here's another one.
Early on the morning of August the 20th, 1961, East German soldiers sealed off the line dividing the eastern sector of Berlin from the American, French and British zones in the west. Building materials were brought out of nearby warehouses, and the notorious Berlin Wall began to take shape, to the great mystification of those on both sides who were soon to be out of sight of each other. The Western powers immediately expressed outrage at this swift and brutal action. The American Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, described the wall as a flagrant violation of the right of free circulation throughout the city, in direct contravention of the four-power agreement reached in Paris in 1949. But it became increasingly obvious there was nothing they could do. As relative was cut off from relative, friend from friend, the pain of it all was quick to spread. But none of this made a dent in the East German government's resolve to go ahead with the wall. They decided to build it to prevent the growing numbers of East Germans from voting with their feet, in other words, fleeing to the West to seek a new life away from the restrictions and disciplines of the communist regime. The wall became a focal point for all that was worst about the Cold War. It became a symbol of a divided world. As a generation grew up behind it, over the years hundreds tried to escape. Through the defences, over them, under them. The mayor of West Berlin, Willy Brandt, called on the East Berliners to be patient. You cannot be held slaves forever, he told them. But they had to wait for more than a generation for that prophecy to come true.
Die Lage in diesem Abschnitt an der Sektorgrenze ist unverändert.
All right, and last one that we're going to watch is the deconstruction of the Berlin Wall and when it was created.
Tear down this wall.
All right, pretty interesting images that you see there on those screens and watching those videos. And can you imagine that emotional connection of literally seeing your loved one not literally one day you can reach them and talk to them, and then the next day you can't. Kind of like what we're experiencing now in our generation, where we can't connect with people right now, and with stay-at-home orders, and obviously there's a big difference there, but it's the same emotional feeling of, why can't I go and just hang out with my buddy? I've got to not do that to stay-at-home orders and all that kind of stuff. So kind of an interesting comparison in the feeling, the emotional comparison. And of course, in 1989, that wall was torn down, and I remember that wall being torn down. I remember watching it on TV. My dad made me, he brought me into the living room, and as it was being broadcast on television, and he said, "Son, this is important. This is something that you need to watch." I was 12 years old, 13 years old at the time, and such an amazing picture to me of seeing this, thing that had been for the past 30 years put up. And so amazing. So anyway, that is the second part of our Cold War series, and we will be continuing. We got 2 more series to go, and we'll go from there. All right, guys, take care.